The camera refused to capture him. Isode pressed the button again, hands trembling as the birthday cake's candles flickered between them, but the phone screen showed only an empty chair where Lance sat smiling. Her blood turned to ice water. She'd been married to this man for 3 years, shared a bed with him, felt his hands on her skin every night, and now the lens revealed what her heart had been whispering in the darkest hours. Something was impossibly, horrifically wrong. When she looked up from the blank screen, Lance's smile had changed into something that didn't belong on a human face, and the temperature in their Kingston apartment dropped so fast, her breath came out in frozen clouds. Isode had never believed in ghosts before that moment. Growing up in rural Jamaica, she'd heard the stories. Her grandmother used to warn her about duppies and rolling calves, about spirits that walked among the living wearing human skin. Isode would laugh, modern and educated, working her way through nursing school while her friends married young. She had plans. She had ambition. She didn't have time for old superstitions. Then she met Lance at her cousin's wedding reception, and everything she thought she knew about herself evaporated like morning mist. He was beautiful in a way that made her stomach drop. Tall, with dark skin that seemed to absorb light, and eyes that held hers across the crowded reception hall like gravity. When he crossed the room toward her, every nerve in her body screamed warning and invitation at the same time. She'd never felt attraction like that, so immediate and consuming it felt like falling. They talked for hours that night. He was charming, attentive, asking questions about her dreams and actually listening to the answers. He worked in construction, he said, traveled a lot for projects. There was something old-fashioned about his manners, the way he stood when she returned from the bathroom, how he walked her to her car even though it was just across the parking lot. He kissed her goodnight, and her knees went weak. They started dating the next week. Looking back now, Isode couldn't remember if she'd given him her number or if he'd just known how to find her. The details had gone fuzzy, dreamlike. She remembered the intensity of it, how quickly she fell. Within a month, they were inseparable. Within 3 months, she'd moved into his apartment. Her friends expressed concern. Too fast, they said. You barely know him. But Isode was drunk on the feeling of being wanted so completely. Lance looked at her like she was the only woman in the world. He cooked for her, rubbed her feet after long shifts at the hospital, made love to her like he was memorizing every inch of her skin. There were odd things, though. Small things she explained away. He never wanted to take photos. Every time she tried to snap a picture, he'd turn his head or put his hand up, laughing it off. He said he was camera shy, that he'd had a bad experience with an ex who posted his pictures everywhere. It seemed reasonable. He never ate in front of her. He'd cook elaborate meals, watch her eat with satisfaction, but always claimed he'd eaten earlier or wasn't hungry. When she pressed, he'd kiss her quiet, distract her with his hands and mouth until she forgot the question. His family never visited. He said they were estranged, that there'd been a falling out years ago over money. She understood that. Her own family relationships were complicated. He had no social media presence, no Facebook, no Instagram, no digital footprint at all. He explained he valued privacy, that the modern world was too connected, too invasive. In a way, she found it refreshing. And there were the cold spots in the apartment, certain corners where the temperature would drop 20 degrees for no reason. Lance said it was poor insulation, promised to call someone to fix it. He never did. They got married at the courthouse on a Tuesday afternoon. Isode wore a simple white dress, Lance wore a dark suit. 2 strangers served as witnesses. Afterward, they got patties from the shop down the street and ate them in the park, Isode laughing as sauce dripped down her chin while Lance watched with that intense, consuming focus he always had. She was happy. She told herself she was happy, but there were nights when she'd wake up and feel Lance staring at her in the darkness. Not the loving gaze of a devoted husband, but something else, something that made her pretend to stay asleep until morning. There were moments when his touch felt wrong, too cold, too insistent, like he was trying to hold on to something slipping away. And there were the dreams. In them, she was in a different house, a bigger house, and there was blood on the walls. A man who looked like Lance but wasn't quite Lance lay on the floor, his head at an impossible angle, while another man stood over him with guilty hands. In the dreams, she was there too, but she couldn't remember being there. The other man would turn to look at her, and his face was Lance's face, and she'd wake up screaming. Lance would hold her when she woke, whisper that it was just stress from work, that she needed to rest more. His skin was always cold when she had those dreams. The day she tried to take his photo was their 3rd anniversary. She'd planned a surprise, decorated the apartment with balloons and streamers, baked a cake from scratch using her grandmother's recipe. She wanted to capture the moment, wanted photos she could show their future children someday. She'd even bought a new phone specifically because the camera was supposed to be amazing. When Lance came home from work, he seemed surprised by the decorations, almost confused, but he smiled and thanked her, pulled her into his arms, and kissed her deeply. They ate dinner, they laughed. Everything felt normal. Then she brought out the cake with its lit candles and told him to make a wish. He sat down, and she raised her phone to capture the moment. The screen showed the table, the cake, the empty chair. She blinked, lowered the phone, looked at Lance sitting right there. Raised the phone again. Empty chair. Her hands started shaking. She took another photo, another. Each time, the screen showed an empty room. No Lance. Just furniture and decorations floating in space where a man should be. "Baby, what's wrong?" His voice came from right in front of her, but when she looked at the phone screen, no one was speaking. "Why aren't you showing up?" Her voice cracked. "Lance, why aren't you in the photos?" His expression changed. The warmth drained out of it like water from a broken glass, and what remained was something ancient and angry. The candles on the cake flickered, then blazed higher, flames stretching toward the ceiling. "You weren't supposed to figure it out yet." His voice was different now, layered with echoes. "We still have work to do." The temperature plummeted. Isode's breath came out in white clouds as frost formed on the windows. The balloons she'd hung began to pop one by one, loud as gunshots in the frozen apartment. "What are you?" She backed toward the door, phone clutched in her shaking hand. Lance stood slowly. His movements were wrong, too smooth, like he was floating rather than walking. "You know what I am, Isode. You've known for a while now. You just didn't want to believe it." The photos on the wall began to rattle. The few pictures she had that he'd allowed, all of her alone or with friends. Never with him. Never any evidence he existed. "The dreams," she whispered. "The dreams are real." "Memories," he corrected. "Your memories, trying to break through what I made you forget." The room spun. Isode gripped the back of a chair to stay upright. "What did you make me forget?" Lance tilted his head, and for a moment, his form flickered like a bad television signal. Behind his handsome face, she saw something else. A glimpse of torn flesh, of bone, of death. "The night we met," he said. "The real night we met. You were in my brother's bed when he killed me." The words hit like a physical blow. Isode's knees buckled, but she forced herself to stay standing. No, I met you at a wedding. We talked, we dated, we fell in love." "You met my brother at a bar. You went home with him. You were there when I came to his house to confront him about the money he stole from our business." Lance's voice was flat now, factual, reciting events like a news report. "You were getting dressed in his bedroom when you heard us arguing downstairs. You heard the fight. You heard me threaten to go to the police." Images flashed through Isode's mind. Not dreams. Memories. A different night, a different man. She'd been lonely, out with friends, too many drinks. A handsome stranger with an easy smile. One thing led to another. She'd woken up in his bed, heard shouting from downstairs. "You hid in the bedroom," Lance continued. "You heard my brother say he couldn't let me ruin everything. You heard the struggle, the sound my head made when it hit the corner of the glass table." Isode was crying now, silent tears streaming down her face. I don't remember any of that. Because I made you forget. When I came back, when my spirit couldn't move on, I found you trying to sneak out the back door while my brother was on the phone with the police, making up a story about a break-in. I saw you, this terrified woman who'd witnessed my murder, and I saw opportunity. The apartment felt smaller now, the walls closing in. Isode's nursing training kicked in, analyzing her symptoms. Hyperventilation, shock, possible psychotic break. But the phone in her hand still showed an empty room, and the cold was too real, and Lance's form kept flickering between man and corpse. I needed someone alive, he said, someone who could interact with the physical world while I gathered strength, someone my brother would trust to get close to him. So I reached into your mind, Isode. I made you forget that night. I planted new memories. I became your perfect man, your whirlwind romance, your husband. The brother. Isode's voice was barely a whisper. What's his name? Lance smiled, and it was the cruelest expression she'd ever seen. Marcus. His name is Marcus, and you're going to help me kill him. No. The word came out stronger than she felt. No, I won't be part of murder. You already are. Lance moved closer, his cold presence washing over her like ice water. Every time we've gone out together, every time you've thought people were staring at you oddly, it's because they saw a woman talking to air. Every conversation you think we had in public, you were having alone. You've been my puppet for 3 years, Isode, dancing on strings you couldn't even see. She thought about all those strange moments. The restaurant hostess who'd set a table for one. The neighbor who'd asked if she was okay after hearing her talking to herself in the hallway. The colleague who'd expressed concern about her living alone. She'd explained it all away, made excuses. Why me? Her voice broke on the question. Why not just possess him, your brother? It doesn't work that way. Blood protects blood, even when that blood is tainted with murder. I can't touch Marcus directly. But you can. Lance's form solidified again, looking almost human. You can get close to him. He's been looking for you, you know. He never forgot the witness who disappeared. Finding you again, after all these years, after he thought you were gone for good, it'll eat at his conscience, make him sloppy. Isode's mind raced. 3 years. She'd lost 3 years to this thing, this ghost wearing her dead husband's face. 3 years of thinking she was happy, thinking she was loved, when really she was just a tool for revenge. What happens when you get your revenge? She asked. Do I get my life back? Lance laughed, and the sound echoed like it was coming from the bottom of a well. What life, Isode? The one where you were so desperate for connection you went home with a stranger, where you witnessed a murder and ran instead of going to the police, where you've been living with a ghost for 3 years and everyone thinks you're crazy? The cruelty of it made her feel sick. He was right. Even if she could prove any of this, who would believe her? She had no evidence, no witnesses, just a phone full of photos showing her alone. I'll go to the police now, she said, more to herself than to him. I'll tell them what happened that night, what I saw. Will you? Lance's eyes glowed faintly in the dim apartment. And what exactly will you tell them? That you witnessed Marcus commit murder 3 years ago but were too scared to report it? That you've been living with his brother's ghost ever since? They'll lock you up, Isode, put you in the psychiatric ward where you can't hurt yourself or others. He was right. The truth sounded insane. She sounded insane. Or, Lance continued, his voice softening to the gentle tone he'd used during their courtship, you can help me finish this. Give me justice. Free both of us from this limbo. When it's done, when Marcus pays for what he did, I can move on, and so can you. It was tempting. For a moment, Isode actually considered it. This thing had stolen her life, but it had also given her something she'd been desperately seeking, the feeling of being loved, of mattering to someone. Even if it was built on lies and manipulation, part of her had been happy these past 3 years. But she thought of her grandmother, who'd raised her to know right from wrong. She thought of her nursing oath, to do no harm. She thought of the woman she'd been before that night in the bar, before the bad decision that had led her here. No, she said firmly, I won't help you kill anyone. I won't be part of your revenge. The temperature dropped further. The windows cracked. The cake on the table rotted before her eyes, candles melting into black wax that smelled like death. Lance's beautiful face twisted into something monstrous. "You don't have a choice." Then he was inside her. It felt like drowning in ice water, like every cell in her body was being invaded by something foreign and cold. Isolde tried to scream, but her throat closed. Her arms and legs moved without her permission, puppet strings pulling her toward the door. She fought. Every nurse learned basic anatomy, learned where the body was vulnerable. She tried to think about those weak points, tried to resist the force moving her limbs. But Lance was in her mind now, sifting through her memories like files in a cabinet. "Don't fight," his voice echoed in her skull. "This will be easier if you don't fight." But Isolde had spent her whole life fighting poverty, fighting to get through school, fighting the expectations that a woman from her background could never be more than a maid or a babysitter. She'd clawed her way to becoming a registered nurse, had survived 12-hour shifts and impossible patients and doctors who treated her like she was invisible. She wasn't going to stop fighting now. She thought about her body, visualized her nervous system, her muscles, her bones. She thought about the electrical impulses that controlled movement, the synapses firing in her brain. Lance was powerful, but he wasn't alive. He didn't have a body of his own anymore. He was borrowing hers, and she knew her body better than he ever could. With every ounce of will she possessed, Isolde grabbed control of her right hand. Just her hand. It was all she could manage. She reached into her pocket, fingers clumsy and shaking, and pulled out her phone. Lance realized what she was doing and tried to stop her, but for a moment, his focus was divided. In that moment, Isolde managed to dial. 911. What's your emergency? She couldn't speak. Lance had control of her voice, but she kept the line open, kept the phone in her hand as her body walked toward the door against her will. "Hello? Is anyone there? I'm showing your location as 47 Meadowbrook Avenue. Are you in danger?" Lance slammed her hand against the wall, trying to make her drop the phone. Pain shot through her wrist, but she held on. The dispatcher was still talking, saying they were sending someone to check on her. With a roar of frustration that she felt more than heard, Lance pulled out of her body. Isolde collapsed to the floor, gasping, every muscle trembling. The phone skittered across the tiles, but the line was still open. "This isn't over." Lance's voice came from everywhere and nowhere. "You're mine, Isolde. You've been mine since the moment I put my mark on you. You can call the police, you can run, but you'll always be mine." Then he was gone, and the apartment was just an apartment again. Warm, normal, empty. Isolde crawled to the phone, brought it to her ear. "Help!" she managed to whisper. "Please help me." The police arrived 15 minutes later. They found her huddled in the corner, shaking, mascara running down her face. They were kind but professional, asking questions she couldn't answer. Had someone broken in? Had someone hurt her? Was she alone? "Yes," she wanted to say. "I've been alone this whole time." Instead, she told them she'd had a panic attack, that she was sorry for wasting their time. They looked at her with concern, at the cracked windows and the rotted cake and the obvious signs of a struggle. They asked if she was sure she was safe, if there was someone they could call. "My grandmother," Isolde heard herself say. "Can you call my grandmother?" They did. Grammy arrived an hour later, took one look at Isolde and the apartment, and started praying in the old way. The officers exchanged glances, thanked Grammy for coming, and left, with promises to patrol the neighborhood. When they were gone, Grammy pulled Isolde into her arms, and Isolde finally let herself cry. She cried for the 3 years she'd lost. She cried for the woman she'd been, who'd made a bad decision and paid for it in ways she never could have imagined. She cried because she was tired and scared and didn't know how to fight something she couldn't see. "Tell me," Grammy said softly, rocking her like a child. "Tell me everything." So Isolde did. She told her about the night at the bar, about Marcus, about witnessing the murder and running. She told her about Lance, about the 3 years that now felt like a dream. She told her about the photos that showed empty rooms and the cold spots and the way she'd lost time. Grammy listened without judgment, her weathered hands stroking Isode's hair. When Isode finished, Grammy was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "You've been ridden by a duppy, child, a vengeful spirit using you for his own purposes." "I know it sounds crazy." "It's not crazy, it's real, old as time, real as the ground under our feet." Grammy stood, her joints creaking. "We need to get you to the church, tonight." "Grammy? I don't think church is going to help with this." "Not just any church. Pastor Williams at the Tabernacle. She knows the old ways and the new. She can help you break free of this spirit's hold." Grammy's expression was fierce. "But we have to go now, before he comes back. Before he gets strong enough to take you over completely." Isode wanted to argue, but what choice did she have? She couldn't stay here. She couldn't go back to her normal life, not when her normal life had been a lie. And Lance had said he'd be back. They left the apartment, Grammy supporting her weight as they walked to the car. The night was warm and sticky, normal Kingston weather, but Isode felt cold down to her bones. As they drove through the dark streets, Grammy began to pray. Not the formal prayers from church, but something older, something in patois that Isode barely understood. Protection prayers, binding prayers. Prayers her grandmother had learned from her grandmother, passed down through generations of women who knew the world held more than what could be seen. The Tabernacle was a small building in a neighborhood Isode didn't recognize. Cars lined the street despite the late hour, and light spilled from the windows. Inside, people were praying, their voices rising and falling in harmony. Pastor Williams met them at the door. She was younger than Isode expected, maybe 40, with locks down to her waist and eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. "This the one?" the pastor asked Grammy. "Yes, she's been marked by a duppy. Needs deliverance." Pastor Williams nodded like this was a common request. "Come, child. We'll see what we can do." They led Isode to a small room at the back of the church. It was simple, just a chair and a table with a Bible and a bowl of water. Candles burned in the corners, their flames steady and bright. "Sit," Pastor Williams instructed gently. Isode sat. She felt numb, disconnected from her body, like any moment she might float away. Pastor Williams pulled up another chair facing her. "I need you to understand something. What we're about to do, it's not magic. It's not tricks. It's spiritual warfare, and it's going to be hard. The spirit that's attached itself to you, it won't want to let go. It's been using you for 3 years, feeding off your energy, your life force. Breaking that connection will hurt." "I don't care," Isode said. "I just want it gone." "That's good. That determination, that will to be free, that's what's going to get you through this." Pastor Williams took her hands. Her skin was warm, almost hot, so different from Lance's cold touch. "But I need to warn you, when we start, he'll come, he'll fight, and he'll try to make you doubt. He'll use your memories, your fears, your guilt. You have to be strong." "I'll try." "Not try. Will. You will be strong." Pastor Williams squeezed her hands. "Now, tell me his name." "Lance." "And the name he had in life?" Isode paused. She realized Lance had never told her his full name, another red flag she'd missed. "I don't know." Grammy spoke up. "The brother, the one who killed him. What's his full name?" "Marcus." Then Isode remembered something, a detail from that terrible night she'd tried so hard to forget. "Marcus Bramwell. He told the police his name when they came." Pastor Williams nodded. "Then his brother was likely a Bramwell too. That's enough?" She stood and began to arrange the candles in a circle around Isode's chair. "We're going to create a barrier. A spiritual shield. When he comes, and he will come, this will keep him from possessing you again. But you have to stay in the circle. No matter what you see, what you hear, you have to stay inside these candles. Understand?" Isode nodded. Grammy and Pastor Williams began to pray. The prayers weren't in English, not entirely. They mixed patois with tongues, ancient words with new ones, calling on protection and deliverance and freedom. Other church members came into the room, forming a circle around Isod's circle, adding their voices to the prayer. The temperature began to drop. Isod felt him before she saw him. That familiar, cold presence, but stronger now, angry. The candles flickered but didn't go out. Lance materialized in the corner of the room, his form more corpse than man. The side of his head was caved in, blood matting his hair, his eyes filmed with death. "You think these people can keep me from what's mine?" His voice rattled like dry bones. "I died for her. I chose her. She belongs to me." "I don't belong to anyone," Isod said, her voice shaking but clear. "You let me in. You welcomed me. Every time we made love, every time you said you loved me, you were giving yourself to me." Lance moved closer to the circle. The prayers grew louder. "You can't take that back. I was tricked. I didn't know what you were. Does that matter? You felt what I gave you. The love, the attention, the feeling of being wanted. You were so lonely, Isod, so desperate to be special to someone. I gave you that. And deep down, you don't want me to leave." It was a lie. It had to be a lie. But a small, shameful part of her wondered if he was right. Pastor Williams put a hand on her shoulder. "Don't listen to him. That's manipulation, not truth. You're not lonely. You're not desperate. You're a strong woman who made the best choices she could with what she knew, and now you're making the choice to be free." Lance laughed, bitter and cold. "Free? She'll never be free. Even if you break my hold, she'll still be the woman who witnessed a murder and did nothing. She'll still be guilty." "That's for the law to decide," Grammy said firmly, "and for God, not for a vengeful spirit who refuses to move on." "I can't move on until Marcus pays for what he did." Lance's form expanded, filling the room, the destroyed side of his head becoming more prominent. "He killed me for money, for a business that was half mine, and he's out there living his life while I'm stuck here, trapped between worlds." "Then go to the light," Pastor Williams said. "Let God's justice work. Let go of your rage and find peace." "There is no peace without revenge." The candles blazed higher. The church members' prayers reached a crescendo. Isode felt something shifting inside her, like roots being torn from soil. It hurt. It hurt so much she wanted to scream. Lance lunged at the circle, but an invisible barrier stopped him. Sparks flew where his ghostly form met the boundary. He howled in frustration. "Isode, please. I love you. What we had was real. Don't let them take me from you." And there it was. The final manipulation, making her think she was losing something precious instead of escaping something toxic. "What we had was never real," she said, tears streaming down her face. "You used me. You violated my mind, my body, my life. That's not love, that's possession." "You're right," Lance said, his voice changing, all pretense dropping away. "It was possession, and I'm not done with you yet." He rushed the circle again, throwing all his spiritual energy at the barrier. The candles flickered violently. One went out, then another. The prayers faltered. "Grammy!" Isode cried out. But Grammy was already moving, relighting the candles with a steady hand, her own prayers never stopping. Pastor Williams stood facing Lance directly. "In the name of Jesus Christ, I command you to release this woman. She is not yours to claim. She is a child of God, and you have no authority over her." "I have every authority." She opened the door. She let me in. "Under false pretenses. That contract is void." "There is no contract in the spirit realm. There is only power, and I have more than you can imagine." Pastor Williams smiled then, a serene expression that seemed out of place in the chaos of the moment. "But you're not the only one with power, and you're outnumbered." She gestured to the circle of church members, and Isode realized they weren't just praying randomly. They were coordinated, their prayers building on each other, creating something larger than any individual could achieve alone. The barrier around Isode strengthened. The candles burned brighter. Lance's form began to waver. "No," He snarled. "No, you can't do this. I won't let you." "It's not up to you," Pastor Williams said. "Isode, tell him. Tell him you revoke his invitation. Tell him you want him gone." Isode stood on shaking legs. She looked at Lance, at this thing that had pretended to be her husband, and felt a complicated mix of emotions. Anger, yes. Fear, absolutely. But also pity. He'd died violently, unjustly, and his inability to let go of that injustice had turned him into something monstrous. "I'm sorry you were killed," she said. "I'm sorry your brother betrayed you, but what you did to me was wrong. You had no right to steal my life, my memories, my choices, so I'm telling you now, you are not welcome here. You are not welcome in my mind, or my body, or my life. I revoke any permission I unknowingly gave. I want you gone." The words felt like power leaving her body. She swayed, dizzy, but Grammy was there to steady her. Lance screamed. It was a sound beyond human, beyond anything living could make. His form stretched, distorted, began to dissolve like smoke in wind. "This isn't over," he managed to say. "Marcus still walks free. The injustice remains." "Then take that up with God," Pastor Williams said. "But you will not use this woman to achieve your revenge. Go now, return to the spirit realm and face your judgment." With a final, anguished cry, Lance's form shattered into 1,000 pieces and disappeared. The room was suddenly warm again. The oppressive cold lifted, the candles burned with normal flames. Isode took a deep breath and felt it fill her lungs completely. No restriction, no presence sharing her body. He was gone. She collapsed into the chair, sobbing with relief and exhaustion. Grammy and Pastor Williams embraced her, their prayers shifting from deliverance to thanksgiving. When Isode could finally speak, she asked the question that had been haunting her. "What do I do now? About Marcus? About that night?" Pastor Williams considered, "That's between you and your conscience, and the law. But I'd advise you to tell the truth. All of it, even the parts that make you look bad. No one will believe me. Maybe not about Lance, but they'll believe you witnessed a murder 3 years ago and were too scared to come forward. That's something they can understand." "I'll go with you," Grammy said. "We'll face it together." Isode spent that night at Grammy's house, in her childhood bedroom that still had posters on the walls and stuffed animals on the shelves. She slept deeply for the first time in 3 years, without cold spots or watching eyes or dreams of blood. In the morning, she and Grammy went to the police station. Detective Crawford listened to her story with a neutral expression that gave nothing away. When she finished, he asked her to repeat it. Then he asked her to write it down. Then he left her in an interview room for 2 hours while he made calls and checked records. When he returned, his expression had changed to something close to respect. "Marcus Bramwell reported a break-in and his brother's death 3 years ago," Detective Crawford said. "Claimed an intruder killed Lance Bramwell during a robbery, but there were always things about the scene that didn't add up. Evidence that suggested a struggle between 2 people who knew each other, not a random break-in." Isode's hands trembled on the table. "So you believe me? About witnessing a murder? Yes. About the rest of it, the spiritual aspects, I'm not the right person to judge that. But your statement about what you saw that night corroborates what the evidence suggested. We never had enough to charge Marcus Bramwell, but we never closed the case either. What happens now? Now we reopen the investigation. We'll need you to give a formal statement, probably testify if it goes to trial. And there may be charges for failing to report a crime, obstruction of justice." Isode had expected that. "I understand." "Why come forward now?" Detective Crawford asked. "After 3 years, what changed?" How could she explain? That a ghost had released his hold on her? That she'd finally woken up from a nightmare that had felt like a dream? "I couldn't live with the guilt anymore," she said simply. "I needed to tell the truth." The detective nodded. "That took courage." The investigation moved slowly at first, then gained momentum. Marcus Bramwell was brought in for questioning. According to Detective Crawford, he'd gone pale when told they had a witness to his brother's death. He'd asked for a lawyer immediately. Isode didn't have to see him, which was a mercy. She'd given her statement, provided every detail she could remember about that night. The police found inconsistencies in Marcus's original story that lined up with what she'd described. Blood spatter patterns that suggested a fight between two people, not a surprised homeowner and an intruder. Financial records showing Marcus had taken money from their shared business account just days before Lance's death. It wasn't enough for murder one, the prosecutor explained, but they could make a case for manslaughter, a fight that had gone too far. In the end, Marcus took a plea deal. 8 years for voluntary manslaughter, 5 years for obstruction of justice, sentences to run consecutively. Isode testified at the sentencing hearing. She had to face Marcus then, had to sit in the witness box while he stared at her from across the courtroom. He looked older than she remembered, tired, defeated. When she described what she'd seen that night, his head dropped into his hands. "I'm sorry," he said when the judge asked if he had anything to say. "I'm sorry to Lance's memory. I'm sorry to Miss Morrison for putting her in that position. I was desperate and stupid, and I took my brother's life. I deserve whatever punishment I get." It wasn't enough. It could never be enough. But it was something. The judge sentenced him to the full 13 years. As for Isode's role in not reporting the crime initially, the prosecutor decided not to press charges. Her cooperation in finally bringing the case forward, combined with the extenuating circumstances of her trauma and fear, worked in her favor. Detective Crawford put in a good word, explaining that witnesses who came forward years later often did so at great personal cost and deserved consideration. But the real work for Isode happened outside the courtroom. Pastor Williams recommended a therapist who specialized in trauma, a woman named Dr. Keisha Chen, who had an office in New Kingston. Isode was skeptical at first. How could she talk to a therapist about being possessed by a ghost? What would that sound like? But Dr. Chen surprised her. She listened to the whole story without judgment, nodding in understanding. What you experienced, whether we frame it as spiritual possession or as a severe dissociative episode brought on by trauma, the impact is the same. Dr. Chen explained during their first session. You lost time. You lost agency over your own life. That's a profound violation, and it's going to take time to heal from it. They worked on memory recovery techniques, helping Isode distinguish between the false memories Lance had planted and her real experiences. It was disorienting, like sorting through a jigsaw puzzle where half the pieces belonged to a different picture. She remembered now, really remembered, the night at the bar. She'd been out with colleagues from the hospital, celebrating one of the other nurses' promotions. Too many drinks, too much laughter, trying to forget the loneliness of going home to an empty apartment. Marcus had been charming in a different way than Lance, more aggressive, more confident. She'd made a choice that night, a choice she regretted, but it had been her choice. She remembered sneaking out of his bedroom when she'd heard the arguing downstairs. Remembered crouching at the top of the stairs, phone in hand, trying to decide if she should call the police or just leave quietly. Remembered the sickening crack of Lance's head hitting the glass coffee table, the way Marcus had stood over his brother's body in shock, hands shaking. She'd run then. Out the back door, into the night, all the way home. She'd convinced herself it wasn't her business, that she hadn't really seen anything, that getting involved would only ruin her life. Then Lance had found her. Guilt makes us vulnerable, Dr. Chen explained. You felt guilty about what you'd witnessed and didn't report. That guilt created an opening. Whether we call it spiritual possession or psychological manipulation, Lance exploited that vulnerability. He made you forget the bad and replaced it with a fantasy of love and connection. But it felt so real, Isode said. The way he looked at me, the way he made me feel. How could all of that be fake? Because part of you wanted it to be real. And our minds are incredibly powerful at creating experiences that feel authentic, especially when we're desperate for something to be true. The therapy sessions were hard. Isode cried through most of them. But slowly, week by week, she began to reclaim herself. She started to remember who she'd been before Lance, before that terrible night. A woman with dreams and ambitions, with friends and family, with a career she'd worked hard for. She returned to work at the hospital, though it took time to readjust. Her colleagues were understanding, knowing only that she'd been dealing with a personal crisis. They welcomed her back with kindness, and Isode threw herself into her nursing duties with renewed purpose. Helping people, really helping them, felt like redemption. Grammy became her anchor during this time. They had dinner together twice a week, and Grammy never pushed for details Isode wasn't ready to share. Instead, she told stories about the old days, about Isode's mother and grandfather, about the strength that ran in their family line. "We've always been survivors," Grammy said one evening over curry goat and rice. "Your great-grandmother survived slavery. Your grandmother survived the hurricane of '51. I survived poverty and losing your grandfather young. You survived something no one should have to face, but you survived it. That's what we do." 6 months after Lance's exorcism, Isode started having the dreams again. But they were different now. In these dreams, she saw Lance as he must have been in life, before his death, before his spirit became twisted with rage. He was laughing with friends, working on a construction site, talking about plans for the future. In one dream, he looked directly at her and said, "Thank you." Then he walked into light so bright she had to close her dream eyes against it. When she told Pastor Williams about it, the pastor smiled. "He's moved on, found his peace." That's what deliverance is supposed to do, not just free the living but free the dead too. Do you think he's forgiven Marcus? I think he's let go of his need for Marcus to suffer. That's not quite the same as forgiveness, but it's enough to break the chains that were keeping him here. Isode thought about that a lot, about the difference between justice and revenge, between healing and holding on to hurt. Marcus was in prison, paying for what he'd done. Lance had moved on to whatever came next, and she was here, alive, trying to rebuild a life that had been stolen from her. The hardest part was facing her own choices. In therapy, Dr. Chen helped her work through the guilt she still carried about that night. "You were a victim too," the therapist reminded her. "You witnessed a crime, and you were afraid. That's a normal human response. Yes, ideally you would have called the police immediately, but fear is powerful, and you were traumatized by what you saw." "I could have saved Lance if I'd called right away," Isode said. "He might not have died if the ambulance had come sooner." "You don't know that, and even if it's true, you didn't cause his death. Marcus did. You can't take responsibility for someone else's violence." It was a lesson Isode had to learn over and over again. She'd made a mistake by not reporting the crime, yes, but she hadn't killed Lance. She hadn't asked to be possessed by his ghost. She'd done the best she could with impossible circumstances, and now she was trying to make better choices. One of those choices was to volunteer at a women's shelter in Kingston. Many of the women there had survived domestic violence, had been manipulated and controlled by partners who'd used love as a weapon. Isode understood that in a way she never could have before. She helped them fill out legal forms, drove them to court dates, sat with them when they were afraid. She didn't tell them her whole story, but she shared what she could. That she'd been in a relationship where she'd lost herself, where she'd been controlled in ways she didn't recognize until it was almost too late. "How did you get out?" one young woman asked during a support group session. "I asked for help," Isode said simply. "I stopped trying to handle it alone and let people who loved me step in. My grandmother, my pastor, my therapist. I couldn't have done it by myself." The women nodded, understanding. So many of them had tried to fight alone, thinking they had to be strong enough on their own. Learning that strength could mean accepting help was a revelation. A year after the exorcism, Isode moved into a new apartment. She couldn't stay in the place she'd shared with Lance, even though logically she knew it had never really been his. Too many memories, real and false, haunted those rooms. The new place was smaller, cheaper, but it was hers. She decorated it herself, choosing bright colors and plants and artwork that made her smile. No cold spots, no feeling of being watched, just an apartment where a woman lived alone and was learning to be okay with that. She went on a few dates, tentatively dipping her toes back into the idea of romance. Most of them were awkward, the men nice enough but wrong for her. One guy showed up to dinner and spent the whole time talking about his ex-girlfriend. Another couldn't stop checking his phone. A third asked her to split the bill down to the cent, including calculating separate portions for the appetizer they'd shared. She laughed about these failed dates with her colleagues at work, treating them as funny stories rather than disappointments. She wasn't in a hurry. After Lance, she knew the difference between genuine connection and desperation dressed up as love. Then she met David at a church function Grammy had dragged her to. He was a teacher at a primary school, patient and kind, with an easy laugh. They talked for hours about their work, about children and healing, and how to help people without losing yourself in the process. He asked for her number. She gave it to him. They started texting, then talking on the phone, then going on actual dates. It was slow and careful, and Isode appreciated that. David never pushed, never made her feel like she had to be anything other than herself. On their 5th date, when he kissed her goodnight, she felt warmth. Just warmth. No alarm bells, no warning signs, no spiritual possession. Just a normal, lovely kiss that made her smile all the way home. "I really like you," he said. "I want to keep seeing you, but I feel like you're holding something back, and that's okay, you don't owe me your whole story. But I want you to know that I'm patient. Whenever you're ready to let me in, really let me in, I'll be here." Isode considered telling him everything. About Lance, about the possession, about the 3 years she'd lost. But it was too much, too soon. Instead, she said, "I was in a bad relationship before. It messed me up in ways I'm still working through, so I need to take things slow." "I can do slow," David said, and he meant it. They dated for 6 months before Isode felt ready to introduce him to Grammy. She was nervous about it, worried Grammy would see something she'd missed, would sense some darkness she'd overlooked. But Grammy took one look at David, hugged him warmly, and pulled Isode aside to whisper, "This one's good. This one's alive." It was the highest praise Grammy could give. Another 6 months passed before Isode told David the full story. They were sitting on her couch, watching a movie, when a character made a joke about being possessed. David laughed. Isode went still. "Can I tell you something?" she asked. She told him everything. The night at the bar, witnessing Lance's murder, the 3 years of possession, the exorcism, the trial. All of it. She expected him to think she was crazy, to make excuses and leave. Instead, David listened quietly, his hand holding hers. When she finished, he said, "That explains a lot. The way you sometimes zone out, like you're checking to make sure you're still in control. The way you always want to take pictures of us together, like you need proof we're real. I noticed, but I didn't want to push." "You believe me?" "I believe that you experienced something traumatic that you interpret as possession. Whether it was literal or psychological, it doesn't really matter to me. What matters is that it happened to you, it hurt you, and you survived it. That's what's real." Isode cried then, relieved and grateful. David held her, and there was nothing cold about his touch, nothing manipulative about his comfort, just genuine care from someone who saw her clearly and chose to stay. 2 years after the exorcism, Marcus Bramwell sent her a letter from prison. It came to Grammy's address, forwarded through the prosecutor's office. Isode almost threw it away without reading it. But curiosity won out. The letter was short, handwritten on lined paper. Marcus's penmanship was surprisingly neat. "Dear Miss Morrison, I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't forgive myself. But I wanted you to know that I think about what I did every day. I took my brother's life in a moment of panic and anger, and I tried to cover it up by letting you believe you were crazy. That was cowardly. Lance was a good man, better than me, and he deserved better. You deserved better too. I'm sorry for my part in your trauma. I hope you found some peace. Marcus Bramwell." Isode read the letter 3 times. She felt a complicated mix of emotions, anger and pity, and a strange sort of closure. Marcus couldn't undo what he'd done, but he was facing it now, living with it, and that was something. She wrote back, a single sentence, "I hope you find peace too." It felt like enough. Pastor Williams held a special service at the tabernacle on the 3rd anniversary of Isod's deliverance. It wasn't just for her, but for everyone in the congregation who'd fought spiritual battles, who'd survived trauma and possession, and the darkness that sometimes crept into human lives. Isodi gave a testimony. She stood in front of the church, hands shaking only slightly, and told a condensed version of her story. She talked about the importance of community, of not fighting alone. She talked about the difference between love and possession, between genuine connection and manipulation. She talked about forgiveness, not for the people who'd hurt her, but for herself. "I blamed myself for a long time," she said. "For going home with Marcus that night, for witnessing the murder and running, for letting Lance into my life without recognizing what he was. But I've learned that blame doesn't help. Action helps. Making different choices going forward helps. Being honest about what happened even when the truth is painful, that helps." The congregation said amen, and Isod felt a weight lift that she hadn't known she was still carrying. After the service, a young woman approached her. She couldn't have been more than 20, with fearful eyes and bruises on her arms that her long sleeves didn't quite hide. "My boyfriend," she whispered. "He's not like yours, not a ghost or anything. But the way you described it, feeling like you're losing yourself, like you can't trust your own thoughts anymore. That's how I feel." Isod took the woman's hands gently. "You can get out. You don't have to do it alone. There are people who can help." She gave the woman her number, the address of the shelter where she volunteered, Pastor Williams's direct line. The woman thanked her with tears in her eyes and promised to call. Isode didn't know if she would. Some people weren't ready to leave, just like Isode hadn't been ready for 3 years, but she'd planted a seed, offered a lifeline, and that was all she could do. David proposed on a Sunday evening, nothing fancy, just the two of them cooking dinner together in her apartment. He'd hidden the ring in the pepper shaker, which was ridiculous and sweet, and so completely him. When she found it, she laughed until she cried. "Is that a yes?" he asked, nervous. "That's a yes," she said. They planned a small wedding at the tabernacle with Pastor Williams officiating, just family and close friends, nothing elaborate. Isod wore a simple dress she'd found at a boutique downtown, and David wore the same suit he'd worn to church for the past 5 years. Grammy cried through the whole ceremony. Before Isod walked down the aisle, Pastor Williams pulled her aside. "You ready for this? For real this time?" "I'm ready," Isod said, and she meant it. This time, when David slipped the ring on her finger and said he'd love her forever, she knew it was real. She knew the difference now between a promise and a possession, between genuine commitment and spiritual manipulation. They took hundreds of photos at the wedding. In every single one, David showed up clearly, smiling, solid, alive. Isod kept one on her bedside table, proof that this was real, this was hers, this was a life she'd chosen with full awareness and consent. The nightmares still came sometimes. She'd dream of cold hands and empty photographs, of 3 years lost to a ghost's revenge. But David would wake her gently, remind her where she was, who she was, that she was safe. "I'm here," he'd say. "I'm real. We're real." And Isod would believe him. She continued her work at the shelter, now with a new focus on helping women recognize signs of psychological manipulation and spiritual abuse. Not everyone's story involved literal ghosts, but plenty involved men who acted like they were entitled to possess a woman's time, mind, body, choices. She taught classes on healthy relationships, on recognizing red flags, on the importance of maintaining your sense of self even when you were deeply in love. She shared her story, carefully edited for the audience, as a cautionary tale. "If something feels wrong, trust that feeling," she'd tell the women. "If you're losing track of who you are, if you can't remember why you made certain choices, if the person who claims to love you makes you feel smaller rather than bigger, that's not love, that's control." 4 years after the exorcism, Isodi got a call from Detective Crawford. Marcus Bramwell had died in prison, complications from a heart attack. He'd been 42 years old. "I thought you'd want to know," the detective said. "The case is officially closed now." Isode thanked him and hung up. She felt sad, but not devastated. Marcus had paid for his crime as much as the justice system could make him pay. Now he was gone, another ghost in a story that had too many already. She wondered if Marcus and Lance had met in whatever came after death. If there'd been reconciliation or just more anger. If Lance had forgiven his brother, or if some grudges lasted beyond life. She'd never know, and that was okay. That night, she lit a candle at her dinner table. Not for ritual or ceremony, just remembrance. For Lance, the man who'd died unjustly. For Marcus, who'd made terrible choices and paid for them. For the version of herself who'd been lost for 3 years. For all the paths not taken and the lives that might have been. David came up behind her, wrapped his arms around her waist. "You okay?" "Yeah," she said. "I'm okay." And she was. 5 years after the exorcism, Isode and David welcomed a daughter. They named her Grace, after Grammy, who cried happy tears while holding her great-granddaughter for the first time. Isode was terrified of being a mother. What if she couldn't protect Grace the way she hadn't been able to protect herself? What if something dark came looking for her again? What if she passed her trauma down to her daughter? Dr. Chen, who Isode still saw monthly, helped her work through these fears. "You're not the same person who was vulnerable to Lance. You're stronger now, more aware. And you have a support system. You won't face any darkness alone." The first time Isode tried to take a photo of Grace, her hand shook so badly David had to do it instead. But the baby showed up perfectly in the picture, solid and real and beautiful. David showed up too, and so did Isode when David took the next photo. They were all there, all real, all alive. Grace grew into a curious, energetic toddler who asked a million questions and insisted on doing everything herself. She had Isode's smile and David's patience, and watching her explore the world with such fearlessness made Isode's heart ache in the best way. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, Isode would hold Grace and think about all the things she wanted to teach her daughter. About being strong, but asking for help when you needed it. About trusting your instincts when something felt wrong. About the difference between love and possession, between connection and control. About how sometimes you lost yourself for a while, but with the right support and determination, you could find your way back. Grammy's health began to decline when Grace was 3. The doctors said it was just old age, organs wearing out after 92 years of hard living. Grammy took the news calmly, like she'd been expecting it. "I've had a good run," she told Isode during one hospital visit. "Got to see you find yourself again. Got to meet your husband and your baby. That's more than a lot of people get." "Don't talk like that," Isode said, even though she knew it was useless. "You're going to be fine. Child, we both know better." Grammy squeezed her hand with surprising strength. "But I'm not afraid. I've walked in the light my whole life. I know where I'm going." She died 3 weeks later, peacefully in her sleep, at home in the bed she'd shared with Isode's grandfather decades ago. The funeral was large, celebrating a woman who'd touched so many lives through her kindness and wisdom. At the burial, Isode felt a familiar coldness brush past her. Not Lance this time, but something gentler. Grammy's presence, saying goodbye one last time. Then warmth, like sunlight breaking through clouds. Pastor Williams, standing beside her, smiled. "She's home now." Life continued. Grace started school. David got promoted to vice principal. Isode became a supervisor at the hospital, training new nurses and sharing her years of experience. The trauma of those 3 years with Lance faded slowly, becoming less like an open wound and more like an old scar, something that had happened but didn't define her entire life. She still went to therapy monthly, still volunteered at the shelter, still told her story to women who needed to hear that survival was possible. But she also went to parent-teacher conferences and date nights with David and family barbecues, where the biggest drama was whether to serve jerk chicken or curry goat. She lived a normal life, and after everything she'd been through, normal felt like a miracle. On the 10-year anniversary of her deliverance, Pastor Williams held another special service. Many of the people who'd been in that prayer circle were still at the tabernacle, older now but still committed to spiritual warfare and helping those trapped by darkness. Isolde stood before them again, but this time she wasn't giving a testimony of survival. She was giving one of gratitude. 10 years ago, I was trapped by something I couldn't see and didn't understand, she said. I'd lost myself so completely I didn't even know I was lost. But this community, Pastor Williams, my Grammy, they saw what I couldn't see. They fought for me when I didn't know how to fight for myself. They showed me that strength isn't just about individual willpower, but about accepting love and support from others. She looked out at the congregation, at the faces of people who'd become family. If there's anyone here tonight who feels lost, who feels like they're not in control of their own life, who feels like something is using them for purposes they don't understand, I want you to know, you're not alone. You don't have to fight by yourself. There are people who will stand with you, pray with you, help you find your way back to yourself. The altar call that night was full. People came forward for prayer, for deliverance, for the simple comfort of being seen and supported. Isolde prayed with them, her hands warm and steady, offering the same lifeline that had been offered to her a decade ago. After the service, a young man approached her nervously. He couldn't have been more than 25, with haunted eyes that reminded her of her own reflection from years ago. I think I'm being followed by something, he whispered, something that won't let me go. Can you help? Isolde smiled gently. I can. We can. You're in the right place. She introduced him to Pastor Williams, watched as the pastor began the process she knew so well. Assessment, prayer, planning. The young man would probably need deliverance, therapy, time to heal. But he'd taken the first step, the hardest step, admitting he needed help. That night, as Isolde drove home to David and Grace, she thought about the long, strange journey her life had taken. From that terrible night at Marcus's house, to 3 years of possession, to freedom, to healing, to building a new life. She thought about Lance wherever his spirit had gone. She hoped he'd found peace, that letting go of revenge had freed him to move forward. She hoped Marcus had too, that death had released him from guilt. But mostly, she thought about herself, about the woman who'd survived impossible circumstances and come out the other side stronger, about second chances and the power of community and the importance of telling your truth even when it sounded like madness. When she got home, David and Grace were building a pillow fort in the living room. Grace squealed with delight when she saw Isolde and ran to hug her legs. "Mommy, come see what we made." Isolde scooped her daughter up, breathing in the scent of her shampoo and childhood innocence. David came over, kissed her softly, asked how the service had gone. "Good," Isolde said, "really good." Later, after Grace was asleep and she and David were getting ready for bed, Isolde caught sight of their reflection in the mirror, both of them clearly visible, solid, real. She smiled. "What?" David asked. "Nothing, just happy." And she was. The story of her possession would always be part of her, a chapter in the book of her life that couldn't be erased or rewritten. But it wasn't the whole book. It wasn't even the most important chapter anymore. The most important chapters were the ones she was writing now, every day, with full awareness and choice. Chapters about love and family and service and healing. Chapters about a woman who'd been lost and found her way home. Sometimes at night, when the house was quiet and everyone else was asleep, Isolde would stand at the window and look out at the Kingston streets. She'd think about all the other people out there fighting battles no one else could see. People trapped by spirits or trauma or abusive relationships or their own guilt and shame. She'd say a prayer for them, that they'd find their way to help, that they'd have their own Grammy and Pastor Williams and Detective Crawford, that they'd survive their darkness and build their light. And then she'd go back to bed, curl up next to her husband, and sleep peacefully through the night. No cold spots, no watching eyes, no possession, just herself, whole and free, living the life she'd fought so hard to reclaim. That was her victory. That was her story. And if sharing it helped even one person realize they weren't alone in their struggle, then every moment of pain had been worth it. Because in the end, that's what mattered. Not the darkness that had tried to consume her, but the light she'd found on the other side. Not the 3 years she'd lost, but the decades she had left to live fully, authentically, freely. She'd been possessed by a ghost, manipulated and controlled and used for revenge. But she'd survived. She'd broken free. She'd rebuilt herself from the ground up, and now she helped others do the same. That was the real miracle. Not the exorcism, though that had been necessary. Not the deliverance, though that had set her free. The real miracle was what came after, choosing every single day to keep living, to keep growing, to keep turning her pain into purpose. Isolde Morrison had been married to a ghost, but she was married to a living man now, mother to a living daughter, friend to living people who loved her and who she loved in return. She was alive. And that was everything. The end. If you or someone you know is experiencing manipulation, control, or abuse in a relationship, please reach out for help. You don't have to fight alone. Contact local domestic violence resources, trusted spiritual advisors, or mental health professionals. Your life and freedom are worth fighting for.